Well, good morning, everybody. While we wait, I'm going to read Esther chapter 4 out for those of you who may not have heard this during the service. So, Esther chapter 4. Mordecai persuades Esther to help. Now, when Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes. He put on sackcloth and ashes and went out into the city, wailing loudly and bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because no one clothed in sackcloth was allowed to enter it. In every province to which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting, weeping, and wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of his sackcloth, but he wouldn't accept them. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out what was troubling Mordecai and why. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. Mordecai told him everything that had happened to him, including the exact amount of money Haman had promised to pay into the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show to Esther and to explain it to her. And he told him to instruct Esther to go into the king's presence to beg for mercy and plead with him for her people. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, "All the king's officials and all the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law, that they be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. But 30 days have passed since I was called to the king." When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you are alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions. Today, I'm going to be talking about an amazing story which would be worthy of a Netflix miniseries or a blockbuster movie. In fact, in 1960, Joan Collins starred in a movie about Esther, so biblical royalty truly met a screen legend. The title of this talk is taken right out of chapter 4 of our reading today and is called "For Such a Time as This." I'm going to start by asking you to think back over your life and ask whether you felt that something happened that proved you were in the right place at the right time. Perhaps you caught a falling child, or perhaps it was a job where you found you could provide exactly the right skills when the boss needed it. Perhaps you were miraculously on hand to provide exactly the right word of encouragement to someone who needed it. Or perhaps it was something much more significant. You had a very tough period in your life, but when you look back at it today, you realized that you were put there for such a time as this. You were in the right time, in the right place, and did the right thing. That is what today's reading and today's message is all about. Now, before I get going, I need to summarize the historical context. The book depicts events that happened around 400 years, give or take a century, before the birth of Christ. And for some, the questions of the historical accuracy of the book of Esther remain a vexed question to this day. But if I was to spend the next 20 minutes talking about that, we would truly miss the point of the book, which is only one of 2 books in the Bible, along with the Song of Solomon, that never mentions the name of God overtly, although I am told that if you look closely enough in the original Hebrew text, you'll find the letters YHWH, a contraction of the Hebrew name for God, at the start of 4 words in the text. Now that's our first lesson. Often, the divine is not to be found in the obvious. We have to search for him, and if we do, we will find him. But I need to move on quickly and build up a picture of the characters, some of whom made very bad decisions. Before chapter 4, the king of Persia runs an amazing banquet. But his former queen, Queen Vashti, fails to honour the king by his presence. The king's courtiers tell him that if he doesn't act, every wife in the kingdom will effectively fail to respect their husband. So, as a result, the king banishes Vashti from his presence forever, granting her wish in an extreme way. This was the time of the exile of the Jewish nation to Persia, so Mordecai was an exiled Jewish person who had to take care of his beautiful and orphaned young relative, Esther. After the disastrous banquet and banishment of Queen Vashti, the king's advisors suggested that he put the word out to the nation to find another queen. To cut a very long story short, Esther was found. She found favour with the king and was admitted to the king's court. Now, a word to the ladies who may be watching. The king of Persia was very discerning in his choice of women. Before any of them could see him, can you guess how long it took them to get ready? Men, at this point, cover your ears. It took a whole year while they received beauty treatments, essential oils and spices before they could see the king. By the time Esther was ready to see the king, she completely won him over. Esther was beauty and brains, all wrapped up together. So in this dysfunctional king's court, all was going swimmingly until along comes Haman. So, at this point we have to set up the story before we get to our reading in chapter 4. After Esther was happily admitted to the king's court as queen, some time passed. Mordecai had toppled a plot to kill the king, but the king had never really shown his gratitude to Mordecai. A character called Haman was ennobled above all the others and became second only to the king. Now this all went to Haman's head, and he issued a decree in the king's name that everyone in the kingdom had to bow down to him. Haman was enraged when Mordecai point blank refused to bow to Haman again and again. Not content with planning to kill Mordecai, Haman wanted to exterminate all the Jewish people as a punishment for Mordecai's disobedience. The king even let Haman issue a national edict for the people to kill all of the Jews, and they went off eating and drinking together. Haman, however, didn't realize that Queen Esther herself was Jewish. Much trouble was brewing. The people were bewildered by this edict, and the Jewish people went into mourning. And so we come to chapter 4. Though Mordecai had previously proved his loyalty by toppling a plot to kill the king, whether Mordecai's refusal to bow down to Haman was simply folly or spirited resistance, we will not find out in this world, but the result was the same. Mordecai, Esther, and all the Jewish nation in exile were to be killed. Mordecai wept bitterly and sat in sackcloth, something that was never supposed to happen in or around the king's palace. He and all the Jewish people mourned and wept bitterly at their impending doom, as their exiled nation had been ordered to turn against them and kill them. Now Esther had been locked down in the king's palace. Remember lockdown? And Esther knew nothing of these events. So wisely she sent word to Mordecai asking what was wrong. Mordecai sent through the text of the king's edict, saying all the Jewish people were to be killed. He asked something that was unaskable, that Esther approach the king without first being summoned, unheard of, and plead for mercy and for the lives of her and her people. To make matters worse, the king hadn't even asked to see Esther for a whole month. Perhaps the king had tired of her. If Esther approached the king without permission against his will, the harsh rules of the court meant that she would immediately be killed. And it says, when Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back this answer: "Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this?" Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go, gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So at this point we come to the story so far. Haman has issued an edict in the name of the king to have all the Jewish people killed unknown to him. That includes Queen Esther herself along with her guardian Mordecai. Haman, intoxicated by his power, revels in his position by the king and abuses his power. The people have been commanded to kill the Jews, and the Jewish people are distraught at the prospect, as is Mordecai. Whether through stubbornness or faith, he's brought potential disaster on them all. And all Mordecai can do is to reach out, as her guardian, to beautiful Queen Esther, for her to plead for the lives of the people. But Mordecai asks the right question. And here I want to pause a little to look at the response of Mordecai. He understands that even bad things can happen for a reason. So, the problem with today, the problem with this reading here in chapter 4 is the story isn't yet finished. Now, doesn't the fact that we have an unfinished story seem very relevant today in so many ways, not least the coronavirus pandemic? Here we all sit, as I am now, in isolation or socially distanced in our homes. We're a bit like Queen Esther. She was isolated in the king's royal palace, and the king wasn't seeing her. Except by messaging, she had no communication with the outside world, but she kept open those lines of communication with Mordecai. What could she possibly do to stop disaster befalling her people? And what can we learn from her? Well, number one, she listened. She listened to her stubborn but loyal relative Mordecai. She communicated. She sought and received messages from Mordecai so she could judge by the facts. She didn't get intoxicated with the power of being queen, like Haman did about being ennobled. Esther made a very big decision. And how about Mordecai? What can we learn from him? He was to a large extent the catalyst for Haman's murderous intent to kill all the Jewish people. However, he let Queen Esther know that she could expect to be killed just in the same way as the rest of her people. They were all in the same predicament together. It's a bit like we all are today, isn't it? Mordecai gave a clear instruction on what Queen Esther would do if they were to be saved. Esther's big decision was to accept that she was in the king's palace for such a time as this. She made the decision to approach the king and accepted her fate. Now this hasn't really been a conventional talk with 3 nice points to make, but I make no apology for that. As I speak at the beginning of May 2020, we live in a locked down world. We have forfeited our freedom to beat the virus, and we remember 75 years ago our forebears fought and won a war against a Nazi threat in Europe. 400 years before Christ, our story today tells of the difficult decision Queen Esther had to make against an evil noble who would kill all her people, and her included. Today, we're all part of a global fight against an unseen viral enemy. Just like Esther in our reading, we have no idea of the outcome, but we know that to save lives the virus must be opposed, just as evil Haman had to be opposed all those years ago. This weekend we have celebrated the Victory in Europe Day, VE Day, in 1945. So what is the answer? What is the bridge between decision and victory? What is the action that we must take to bridge the gap between the present suffering and the future victory? Before I answer that, I guess you're wondering what happened next in our story today. Well, I'm not going to tell you. If you want to find out, by all means reread chapter 4, but go on to read chapters 5 to 7 of the book of Esther to see how the events play out. I'll give you a clue. Things don't go well for Haman, just like they didn't go well for Hitler in the Second World War, and just like things won't go well for coronavirus when it comes up against a viable vaccine. But what must we do? What is the action we must take to bridge the gap between our present suffering and the future victory? First, we must listen to the cries of the people and lift our eyes heavenward in prayer when we don't know what to do. Second, we must risk all to do the right thing, just as Esther did, and just as those who gave up their lives and future so we might all taste freedom again in the Second World War, and just as those on the health and care front line do today. Third, we must seek opportunities to influence the outcome, because we all might have been brought to this point with all of our strengths and all of our weaknesses, just like Esther, for such a time as this.